I skipped ahead a little bit to this section in the religion and race speech that we have been reading this last month or so. The last section is really quite interesting, but I feel a little bit repetitive of some things that we've done before. But I do encourage you to read the speech in its entirety. For those who are joining us after a hiatus, I'll just remind us quickly that the speech we're reading is delivered by Abraham Joshua Heschel in 1963 to the National Conference on Religion and Race, convened in DC and led by Dr. Martin Luther King. This would be the place where Heschel and King formed their relationship and where we see the ideas that were first developed in Heschel's writings in the Prophets, going all the way back to his doctoral work in Germany in the 1930s, really crystallizing into his message of social change that would be his signature in the last 10 years of his life through the 1960s and his involvement with the civil rights and peace movements. And so we see many of the themes that appeared first in What Manner of Man is the Prophet and his analysis of Isaiah and Jeremiah now being played out as he is assuming that prophetic voice and that prophetic role together with other figures who are helping to envision a more racially healed America and a better and more cohesive society in general. I'm starting with section 49 here on the screen. Equality is a good thing. A fine goal may be generally accepted. What is lacking is a sense of the monstrosity of inequality. Seen from the perspective of prophetic faith, the predicament of justice is the predicament of God. So Heschel starts by saying everybody would agree, really 99.9%, that they are in favor of equality. That is a fine goal. That is something that we can generally hold to be a self-evident principle across the spectrum of ideology. We're all in favor of equality. What's lacking, he says, is a sense of the monstrosity of inequality. And that goes back to the ideas of the prophets, where we spoke again and again about the prophets as feeling more deeply things which we might generally write off as trivial. That the prophet is the person with no skin, with no barrier between them and the offenses of the world. Everyone would agree that living in a society with equality is a good thing. But what Heschel says is we lack that prophetic sensitivity that makes living with inequality something we couldn't bear. So seen from the perspective of prophetic faith, seen from the perspective of this prophetic tone of deep sensitivity, the predicament of justice is the predicament of God. And what I want to talk about tonight, primarily in this section, is Heschel's theology. What does God have to do with the search for equality and justice? How is this a deeply, not just religious, but theological conversation for him? Of course, I'm back to reading. He says in his moment in 1963, there is growing awareness that there is a problem in America, that the color line, that the persistence of segregation and inequality, even after landmark Supreme Court decisions in the previous decade, people are aware in a way that perhaps they were, or at least white people, were not top of mind aware before this time period. But he says, we fail to personalize that problem. We who are not immediately impacted by it, we experience it as one of the brokennesses of our society, rather than as something which is personally painful to us. And I think that there are many examples, then and now, of things which we can see as wrong in the societies in which we live, and which we can feel free to morally condemn, but which don't bother us on a day in, day out basis. We are collectively in agreement, I am sure, that there should not be people who are unhoused. There should not be children who go hungry. There should not be people whose rights are not respected. We can collectively agree on these things, but do we lose sleep about them? Are we aware of them as a social ill, or are we aware of them as what he calls a monstrosity, something to be terrified and therefore moved to action because it is personally impactful to me? The history of interracial relations is a nightmare. Equality of all men, a platitude to some minds, remains a scandal in many hearts. Inequality is the ideal setting for the abuse of power, a perfect justification for man's cruelty to man. Equality is an obstacle to callousness, setting a limit to power. Indeed, the history of mankind can be described as the history of tension between power and equality. I'm wondering if we can talk about this line, because that's a big claim. That's a big claim, that the history of us as a species is the history of a tension between the claim of power, the desire to serve the self and the immediate circle, and the claim of equality, some sense of the sisterhood and brotherhood of all people. That for concern for me and concern for us, concern for my desire to get ahead and my desire to be in community where we all are running the same race together, that is the fundamental animating tension of history. It's a big claim. I'm wondering if anybody would like to respond to that claim. Do you think that that's an accurate statement? How do you see that reflected either in the history of Jewish ideas, though he's not here claiming it's a specifically Jewish thing. He is saying this is part of the history of the human species, the tension between the me and the us, the tension between the desire to power and the drive to fulfill the conscience in the form of equality. Anybody would like to respond to that claim, what that means to you? Yeah, please. I see a hand at the tracts.
Hi. I think that's going on right now. I mean, we're seeing it right now with our government, where the powers to be are callous and just there's no regard for humanity. I am not seeing it. So it's so timely. I just everything that we're talking about is just so timely. It's upsetting.
Part of what might make it timely, and I want to say a couple of things real quickly, part of what make it timely is exactly this claim that Heschel's making, which is that it is always timely. That no matter in what era you live, there is always a tension playing out between the drive to power and a moral drive toward creating what we call in America a more perfect union, right? Creating a society of equality. That anytime we would gather to study this, I think we would say, we recognize that, because it is an eternal sort of a tension. I think for many of us are able to identify it in a myriad ways today, but I would certainly claim, and I think I'd feel comfortable claiming, that if we gathered to study this during the last presidential administration or the presidential administration before that or the administration before that, somebody would say, this is so timely. Because the truth is these issues are beyond any one individual or one government or one society. They are, Heschel says, a universal dance. I do want to say, last time I ran this class 2 weeks ago, I let this go a little bit farther than my comfort zone. I would like to keep this in the realm of the issues that we face collectively and keep it out of the personalization to figures and political leadership to the extent that we can. I know that that's quite challenging, but I do want to recognize that we are a diverse group in lots of different ways, including a politically diverse group. And I don't think that there can be an assumption that everybody who's on the screen shares exactly what one means when they say this moment. So this is a discussion forum in which we can talk about real issues and real challenges, but I would ask us to keep in mind that we are in a diverse setting, and I'm saying that to myself as well, and that want to make sure that this is issues oriented rather than personalities oriented. Yes, this is the historic challenge the challenge between the us and the we, the challenge between the drive to power and the drive to support the collective. Is there anything which is surprising about this statement? Is it optimistic or pessimistic about humanity?
Not to anybody that studied history, and yeah, it is pessimistic.
You say it's pessimistic because this challenge is eternal. We are always going to be dealing with the challenge of power versus the collective good.
Well, for thousands of years we have. Whether there's some godlike figure that comes on the horizon, that's hard to predict. I hope.
With the coming of Mashiach, maybe, but Mashiach's been real delayed for a real long time. Yeah, right? Dr. King says that the moral arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice, which means that in the end, to be a person of faith is to believe that light wins over darkness, but it's taken a sweet time in doing so. So there's something realistic, honest, Rochelle says, maybe even a little bit pessimistic, Hunter. This is always going to be a conflict. Ruth, I think a hand pop up. Yeah, please.
I actually think it's kind of a human condition situation and, ambitiousness and like you can't, I guess what I'm trying to say is if you are looking for power, you have to other people. Because it's, I hate to say it, but I think it's a zero-sum game, Anyway, that's it.
The mentality of power, at least power as it's being used here, is generally, I think, understood to be in zero-sum terms. He's saying there is a tension between a zero-sum game and a game where everybody can win. Equality is a game where everyone can win. Power is a game where one person wins. Now, there may be alternative definitions of power, but I think that is how he's using this. And that tension between zero-sum, I want to collect as many of the goodies as I possibly can because I want to take care of me and my family and my tribe. And I'm not going to worry about or even actively work against my neighbor getting a share of the goodies. That's very, very human, for sure. Gail, I see a hand.
Yes. First, I want to apologize for not having my camera on, but I have Wi-Fi issues. If I turn my camera on, I'll have trouble with connection.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you. I think one of the problems is, even though pretty much everyone agrees with the idea of equality, to get there, because of what's happened historically, it means giving some people an extra foot up, which to a lot feels like it gives them a step down. And that as much as people believe in it, they're not willing to accept the pain that comes to get there.
So the end goal might be something that we can agree on. We agree that we want to live in a society of equality, but the process that it would realistically take to get there and the sacrifices that would be asked of people in order to get there may be unacceptable, even to reasonable and moral people.
Exactly.
Right? There are people who live in the urban area near my home who could absolutely be housed if I sold my home worth $1.5 million somehow, an insane number. If I sold my home and bought 10 unhoused people, each $100,000 condo, I would be living a full egalitarian ideal. I'm not prepared to do that. And I don't know that that makes me a terrible person, right? There is always a greater sacrifice of self that could be offered. And there is a reasonable point at which one says, I prioritize the well-being of my child over the well-being of your child. If we didn't do that to some extent, if we didn't to some extent take care of our loved ones first, we would lose all meaningful social ties with one another. So the process of getting to a agreed upon ideal, all people should be equal, might actually necessitate uncomfortable compromises, and it might even necessitate compromises that no reasonable person is going to make if taken to its greatest extreme. Yeah, Arlene, please.
But what if we all did our part? You don't have to sell your home, and I don't have to sell my home. But we give what we can, probably more than we do, and direct that attention at a problem, whether it's the unhoused living nearby or our immigrant neighbors, whatever the problem is. It shouldn't take one individual. You're not the prophet, right? With having to give everything to get the message out. We all have a responsibility to contribute.
So maybe one of the big challenges here is we have a collective value, equality, that most of us would buy into, but we don't necessarily have the kind of community where we feel shared enough responsibility and enough trust in one another that we could collectively move the needle. And there is a challenge of social breakdown. I'm not going to be willing to give up everything I have while I know that my neighbor isn't. Instead, by the just sheer logic of it, I'm going to entrench in my selfishness because I don't trust my neighbor to not do the same. I do want to, though, point out here that Heschel's pronouncement that history is a tension between power and equality assumes that we have an altruistic drive toward equality, right? It assumes that we are not just interested in ourselves, we are also interested in each other from the very beginning. That's not necessarily self-evident in the history of human beings. There have been many philosophers who have condemned human beings as inherently and always selfish, and could say the history of mankind is the history of power or the history of selfishness. But Heschel says we have within ourselves both. We have within ourselves a drive to serve ourselves, and we have within ourselves and I think he would say, divine mandate to be other-serving. And so Heschel is not purely condemning humanity as always mired in our selfishness. He is saying we are complicated. We're complicated. We are at the same time seeking our power and at the same time seeking the good of one another. And the question is, what angels will we listen to most? Or how will we balance between these two human drives? I'll say a last thing, I want to kick it over the Goldmans. There's a story told in the Talmud about a divine experiment in which God kills the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is generally referred to as the evil inclination, but really what it means in rabbinic sources is the self-serving need. The Yetzer Hara is the voice that is the voice of power and the voice of my needs. And in the story in the Talmud, God kills the Yetzer Hara. And what happens? Nobody makes a family, and nobody goes to a job, and nobody writes a book, and nobody makes any art. And society becomes just sort of blah. And God then reintroduces the Yetzer Hara and says, people need both. They need the drive that drives them to acquisition and to greatness and to investment in a small circle, in a family, in a community. And we need our selflessness at the same time. And the trick is not to become one thing or the other. The trick is to achieve some kind of moral balance. Please, Eileen or Mitch or your grandchild.
Just quickly, I think the biggest problem here, and Heschel doesn't do us any favors, is I'm not sure we can even agree on a definition of equality. Some people say equality of outcome, some people equality of opportunity. And if you can't start with a definition of equality, it's difficult to imagine reaching anything. I'm sure some people here think equality is a matter of outcome, and some people here think equality is a matter of opportunity. And Heschel doesn't define it. And I'm just curious which one you think he's talking about.
And I think
by the way, I disagree that it's a zero-sum game. It's absolutely not a zero-sum game. There are some situations that are zero-sum, but for the most part, society is not zero-sum. It's dynamic.
And I think, as I'm understanding it, I think he's saying the same thing. I think he's saying there is a tension between the zero-sum story and the non-zero-sum story. I think he's calling the pursuit of power the zero sum. I think that's what he's saying. I think the pursuit of power is the pursuit of my good at the expense of another's good. And his term for equality is my good along with another's good. I think that's how he's defining. But I think, Mitch, your point is also well taken when he says, but he starts out and he says, everybody agrees that equality is a good thing, but it's a platitude. They agree with it in theory. It's when the rubber meets the road, how do we actually get there and what do we mean? And that's, I think, what he wants to explore. I think that's precisely kind of what he's condemning, to say, yeah, we believe in this in theory. Okay, what do you mean by that? What are we trying to get to? And he does have, I think, an idea, which we may or may not all agree with. Let's take a look. Let's see what he has to say. Equality is an interpersonal relationship involving both a claim and a recognition. My claim to equality has its logical basis in the recognition of my fellow man's identical claim. Do I not forfeit my own rights by denying to my fellow men the rights I claim for myself? So he starts off by trying to explore the concept. I don't know if he defines it, but explore the concept of equality. And he says equality is a function of relationship. It's about the way that we relate to one another, and it involves two pieces: a claim to my value, and a recognition of the other's value. I claim that I am worthy and that I matter in the world. I am not nothing. And I also recognize that you are worthy in the world, that you matter, and that you ought not, and I think I can extend here using Buber's language, you ought not be a means to my ends. You ought not be a means to my ends because you have value in and of yourself, just as I ought not be a means to your ends. I have value in and of myself. So equality for him begins in relationship, and it begins with a claim about who we are, and it begins with a claim or a recognition that everybody has that same claim. And he says, do I not forfeit my own rights by denying to my fellow the rights I claim for myself? A relationship that is only one-sided, a relationship in which only one person in the relationship holds value and power, is not a relationship. And if equality is about relationship, then one person saying, yes to me, no to you, is denying the fundamental interrelatedness, he would say, of us as a human family. So equality for Heschel is dynamic, and it's formed by the encounter between me and the world, and a recognition that the truth that I hold about me, of who I am and what I'm worth, is also true about everybody else. There is that wonderful word that I can never remember, but it's a beautiful word for the realization that everybody else has an inner life. Anybody know what that word is? Wonderful word. The realization that every person you meet has an inner life. The realization that I had in third grade, and I remember it, realizing that every person I met on the street of every age older than me had a third grade teacher. Every single one of them had a third grade teacher. We all shared this universal human experience, and the people who were profoundly different than me all had a memory of what it was to have a third grade teacher. That experience of realizing that we are our own little world, but so is everybody else, is a moral awakening and creates a sense of interrelatedness. You're a world, I'm a world, and in the immortal 1984 pop hit, we are the world. Here's some of the theology, though. 53. It is not humanity that endows the sky with inalienable stars. It is not society that bestows upon every man his inalienable rights. Equality of all men is not due to man's innocence or virtue. Equality of man is due to God's love and commitment to all man. The ultimate worth of a man is due neither to his virtue nor to his faith. It is due to God's virtue, to God's faith. Wherever you see a trace of man, there is the presence of God. From the perspective of eternity, our recognition of equality of all men seems as generous an act as the acknowledgement that the stars and the planets have a right to be. How can I withhold from others what does not belong to me? Just as we are a ideologically diverse group and diverse group in terms of backgrounds, I am sure that we are a theologically diverse group. I am sure that we have collected here believers, agnostics, devoted unbelievers. It's great in a Jewish gathering that we have space for a religious conversation with people all across the theological spectrum. Heschel is invested in the idea of God. Heschel is a believer, unapologetically, and he is not a believer in a God of abstraction, a philosopher's God, a God who set things in motion and stepped out of the picture. Heschel is a believer in the prophet's God, which is a God who is intimately and deeply and personally invested in history, a God who we can address as a subject, a God to whom you can say, right, not just the ground of being or the mystery of existence, but a being who cares, being who cares. And Heschel, from this place as a believer, from this person representing 3,000 years of Jewish spiritual sensitivity, says that Judaism has a specific claim about what makes each person able to say, I am a world in and of myself, I am worthy of dignity, and therefore need to recognize that you are too. That it doesn't come from the society in which we live, and it doesn't even come from the moral virtue of any particular person. You don't earn your worth. How does your worth come to you? It comes to you because God loves you and believes in you. Now, on Monday nights, I hang out with a group of evangelical Christians. They're my next door neighbors. I love them. They have a 5-year-old girl who is Grace's, well, top of the list best friend. She has many best friends. He teaches theology at Biola University. He's the one who bought CBI's chametz, who's very proud of that, very excited to do it. And they host a Monday night gathering at their house of their friends, mostly friends from church and from Biola and the Jewish neighbors. And I love it because my life is with Jews. They happen to be lovely people. I would love them no matter what. But I especially love it because my life is with Jews. And for one night a week, I'm with people who are just as deeply committed as I am to a world which is quite theologically different than mine. I would expect very comfortably that at my Monday night gatherings with these friends, that I would hear something like this. Where does human worth come from? It comes from the fact that God loves each and every one of us, an unearned love, a love that we don't have to justify through our actions, a love that we hold eternally by virtue of God being God. I would, in my Jewish parochialism, hear that first and think, that sounds kind of Goyish. That sounds kind of not Jewish, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. I'm a rabbi, big shocker. I stand up and talk on a week-to-week basis. I never get up and give a sermon that begins, I just have to tell you something, God loves you. If I began a sermon that way, I think people would come up to me afterwards and say, are you doing okay? How's your week been? Everything all right? How's your blood sugar? Right? Like that would worry people if I led with God love. It's not a familiar and comfortable language, I think. I mean, somebody can tell me I'm wrong. In many, many Jewish communities, that's not familiar and comfortable language. But here Heschel is saying, how do you know that you're worthy? You're worthy because God thinks you're worthy. God has faith in you. And it would be pretty monstrously arrogant to think God has faith in me, but God doesn't have faith in Diane. I mean, particularly Diane, but like, how crazy would I have to be? How arrogant would I have to be to believe that the God of the universe just loves me and doesn't love you too? That I'm God's special little boy. Like, that's a bonkers bananas thing to try to claim. Heschel says, if you really believe in a God who's actually God, God's going to love all the children the way a good parent loves all the children, which is equally. And you are invested in worth because you are loved by God. Diane, what do you do with that?
So this is so interesting. Just as a side note, Bruce and I always say when we've watched a series on Netflix or Hulu that the ones that really ring to us are the ones that are all about love ultimately. And as someone who works with children, it's the children who have very loving parents. I mean, there's never been a parent that is too loving to give that child the strength to be able to do what they have to do. And so what you're mentioning here also what goes through my mind when I look at what's going on in the world, that when people, and this is just my own little thing, that when people feel loved, whether they were brought up, whether they had a lousy childhood but they're still very connected to God or whoever that supernatural person is that they feel, I think they're able, when you're filled with love, you're able to see someone else and see someone else's need and put yourself out. And when there isn't that love individually, then I think it's harder to, they strive more for power to fill that void, or they strive, they don't see the equality that our society or our community may need because they are so desperately trying to fill that hole. And that's what I have to say.
It turns out attachment theory really does explain everything, right? It turns out that if you are hugged enough between 0 and 5, you walk around in the world expecting that you will be loved and capable of offering that love. And if not, you're going to have to do some serious work. It's not impossible, but you're going to have to actually notice it and do some serious work. We are powered by the love which is invested in us early. And the dividends of that love which is invested in us are our greatness in the world or our struggle in the world. When I do a baby naming, I always have the grandparents, if we're lucky enough to have grandparents present, stand behind their children as their children hold their child. And I always say the same thing to the grandparents. I say, what you see right now is the dividends of love invested. That here, all that you poured into them, they are now, with full cups, able to pour in to the next generation. And that's how love works. So this idea that if we all believed that we were loved with an eternal love, an ahavat olam, and a great love, an ahava rabbah, as we say in our prayers, if we really, really believed in that love and we felt it, maybe even if we weren't lucky enough to get it from the caregivers who were supposed to give it to us in person, maybe we could at least get it from God. And I know people who've been saved by that, who said, I didn't get the love I needed from the people who ought to have done it, but I feel the love of God. And that's what saves me over and over again. Those of us who are lucky enough to get both, how blessed are we? How blessed are we? So this idea that knowing that we are loved, knowing that we are believed in, can power us to make good choices and loving choices and selfless choices going forward. I think that's a powerful psychological insight and also really a religious one. Thank you, Diane. Beautiful. Others, what is your reaction to this idea that our value is not based on our virtue? Our value is based on God's love and faith in us. Does that challenge you? Does that inspire you? Does that leave you a little alienated and you've got a question that maybe somebody else might be able to help? What do you think? Is this a good conversation for small groups? Maybe. Why don't we dip into a group for 5 minutes? You don't have to be brave in front of many people, just be brave in front of a few people. Let's take 6 minutes in groups to talk about Heschel's claim that our value comes from being loved by God. Just coming back. You pose a big question. There's never enough time. Hopefully you heard some interesting thoughts. Let's take a look at just a little bit more Heschel as we bring this to a close. Equality, Heschel claims, comes from our claim that we have worth and our recognition that other people have an equal claim. And to engage in behaviors that lead to inequality is to, as he says in line 55, withhold from others what does not belong to me. I cannot take away your dignity because your dignity comes from a source beyond each of us or either of us. It comes from God. Equality as a religious commitment, line 56, goes beyond the principle of equality before the law. So that is part of an answer to Mitch's question. Does he define equality here as equality of outcome or equality of process, everybody having the same opportunity? Heschel, at least, says, no, it goes beyond everybody has the same opportunity. It goes beyond the level playing field. Equality as a religious commandment means for him personal involvement, fellowship, mutual reverence and concern. Equality means if I take seriously that I have God-given worth and so do you, then I have to be personally engaged with you. I have to see myself in fellowship with you. I have to hold mutual concern, even mutual, love this word, it's challenging, mutual reverence. I need to revere the God in you as I would expect you to see and revere the God in me. It means my being hurt when a Negro is offended. It means I'm bereaved whenever a Negro is disenfranchised. The shotgun blasts that have been fired at the house of James Meredith's father in Mississippi make us cry for shame wherever we are. There is no insight more disclosing. God is one and humanity is one. There is no possibility more frightening. God's name may be desecrated. God is every man's pedigree. He is either the father of all men or of no man. The image of God is either in every man or in no man. The only way, he says, that we can maintain the oldest piece of biblical theology we have, the idea of being made B'Tselem Elohim that goes back to the very first chapter of Genesis, the only way that we can stay true to that first thing we are told about human beings, that they are made in the image of God, is to recognize its universality. And the second we cease to do that, we give lie to our believing it in the first place. This is what one of my teachers, Rabbi Sharon Brous, says is the fundamental incompatibility of religion and racism. It is fundamentally incompatible to believe or to say one believes that we all share one parent and that that parent is good, and then to believe that that parent has children that they love and children that they could care less about. One can say, I believe in God, and one can treat other people like trash, but that belief can't possibly be terribly deep if it does not force one to act in a different way towards one's neighbor. And so Heschel is challenging us. Say, what would it actually look like? Beyond platitude, beyond, this is a great principle that we could all agree on. All of us are made in the image of God, and therefore all of us should be equal. What would it actually mean to really, truly feel that way, and then let that motivate us into action? What would it really, truly look like to every single person that we see say, image of God, image of God, image of God, and hold and expect back mutual concern and reverence? I went to a presentation, this past weekend was the LA Times Festival of Books, which is one of my favorite events. I don't go to it anymore because it's now at USC. It used to be at UCLA, and I would go every year, and they moved it to USC, and I won't be caught dead. It's not true. I just became Shomer Shabbos, and Sunday is always busy with something. But I love the Festival of Books. And one of the most impactful panels I went to, I think when I was still an undergrad at UCLA, maybe even before, I would go as a kid, was a panel of foreign war correspondents who had each written books about their experience in the field. And one of them, I remember her talking about what she called the newsroom formula. And the newsroom formula, she said, is how to apportion airtime in a news broadcast. And she said, for American television, the newsroom formula is 1 American life corresponds to approximately 10 Middle Eastern lives, corresponds to approximately 100 Asian lives, corresponds to approximately 1,000 African lives, something like that. She said that's roughly how you apportion out news coverage. And if the one American is blonde and attractive, forget it, clear the decks, right? And we sort of know. We know that the number of column inches in the newspaper for an earthquake that kills 10,000 people in Bangladesh is roughly equivalent to the number of column inches about a story that happens to 10 people in Europe or the Middle East is about roughly equivalent to a story of local American interest. Not exactly, but we know in general the principle that she's talking about. We know that we have circles of concern, that we show greater depth of investment in the people who are geographically proximate to us, who are similar to us, who are similar of ideology, who are similar of background, who are similar of socioeconomics. And Heschel begins by acknowledging that that's eternally human. We are always going to, in some part of ourselves, operate in the world in zero sum. We're going to operate and say, I have a limited amount of attention. I'm going to give it first and foremost to the people I perceive to be the closest to me, because there is a truth to that. I do have a limited amount of attention. I do have a limited amount of resources. I do have a requirement to take care of my kid before I take care of your kid, to put on my oxygen mask before I put on your oxygen mask. That's a true thing. And Heschel says, and, not but, and we have, as creatures made in the image of God, a persistent whispering voice that says, yeah, but remember, everybody has that same worth in God's eyes. Everybody. You like them, you don't like them, you agree with them, you don't agree with them, you think they're good, you think they're bad, they're simply not in your radar of concern. Everybody had a third grade teacher. Everybody has a story. Everybody has dreams. Everybody has desires. Everybody shares the same rich inner life that you and I share. Sonder is the word. Thank you very much to the person who put that in the chat. Everybody is made in the image of God and is part of God's family. And therefore, I need to hold in tension my drive to power, my drive to care for my immediate, and my awareness of a deeper and broader and more universal truth, which is that I can't morally justify any act which treats anyone as less than what they are, which is as fully invested in with God-given dignity as anybody else. And that's the encapsulation of my favorite passage in the Talmud, the one that I was asked in my rabbinical school interview when I was 20 years old. If I could teach one text for the rest of my life, what would it be? And it's the only answer from that rabbinical school interview panel that I would give the same way today as I did way back then. And it's the Mishnah in Tractate Sanhedrin that says, therefore, Adam was created alone in order to teach you that whosoever destroys one life destroys the entire world, and whosoever saves one life saves the entire world. It's what's superimposed by Spielberg over the scene when we see all of the children and grandchildren of those who were saved by Schindler. That line that says, we all started from one, made in the image of God, so that we can know that each and every one is a complete world. And we're made with an impulse in us, Heschel says, optimistically, I think. We're made with an impulse to live up to that truth, which is always going to fight with the part of ourselves that thinks about me first. And so Heschel goes on to say, God's covenant is with all men, and we must never be oblivious to the equality of the divine dignity of all. The image of God is in the criminal as well as the saint. How can my regard for man be contingent on his merit if I know that in the eyes of God, I myself may be without merit? If we take seriously the prayers that we say on the High Holy Days, where we say, our parent, our sovereign, we have sinned before you, be good to us even despite our lack of merits. If we plead for that for ourselves every year, how can we assume that we are God's special little boys and girls? You shall not make yourself a graven image or any likeness of God. The making and worshiping of images is considered an abomination, vehemently condemned in the Bible. The world and God are not of the same essence. There can be no man-made symbols of God. Right? This is the second commandment. This is the prohibition on idolatry. And yet, there is something in the world that the Bible does regard as a symbol of God. It is not a temple or a tree. It is not a statue or a star. The symbol of God is man, every man. How significant is the fact that the term tselem, which is frequently used in a damnatory sense for a man-made image of God, as well as the term demut, likeness, of which Isaiah claims no demut can be applied to God, are employed in denoting that man as an image and likeness of God. The terms that are used in Genesis is that God is, the people are made, b'tselem Elohim, b'damut Hashem, in the image and likeness of God. Man, every man, must be treated with the honor due to a likeness representing the King of Kings. It's a provocative challenge and one with very, very real individual interpersonal, and societal implications. If we start from a first principle that says that each and every person is invested with a dignity that comes from beyond themselves, that is irrespective of their merits, irrespective of their story, irrespective of their geography, irrespective of their race, color, creed, that God loves all God's children equally, then we are obligated to do everything we possibly can to be building up a society of mutual concern and mutual reverence for that image of God in us. And for Heschel, that has to be theological. Heschel says if we take it out of the theological context, if we depend on people to see the inherent dignity of each other, we're going to fail. We are going to fail. We are going to prioritize our own tribe over and against the tribe of others. We are going to let our selfish impulse overwhelm us. The only way that we are going to get to the level of regard that we are supposed to give to one another is to posit that we have a shared parent. And I want to say, for those who can't believe that, maybe it's worth just behaving as if, just for this, even if you don't believe that the old lies are true, even if you don't believe that the old stories could possibly have merit, to just live as if and to keep telling ourselves over and over again the story, we are sisters and brothers, and the answer to the very first question that anybody ever asked God, am I my brother's keeper, is a big fat yes, then maybe we can get a little bit closer to that. That religion has a powerful job to play, even in the scientific secular age, has a powerful job to play in teaching us to regard each other as family. And by embracing that story, that meaning-giving story, whether we believe it to be literal or we believe it to be metaphorical, by embracing that story, we give ourselves the very, very best chance of getting closer to the kind of world that we claim we want to see, but that could become simply platitude and not reality. I hear my daughter calling. It's 7:06. I'll let you go. Good night. Take care. Nice to learn with all of you.